The game where two legends compete. It's a great game. Nezhmetdinov starts with e4. Tal's response is c5. The Sicilian defense that creates an imbalance on the board and gives crucial counter chances. Knight f3, d6. When you develop your knight from the f6 square, soon after, the knight will no longer be disturbed with e5. d4. An open variant that prepares a fast piece deployment, tries to open the center immediately, and therefore can lead to more tactical positions. C takes d4. Of course, Tal would be happy to make that exchange. After all, he does have a 2-1 pawn advantage in the center. He can also have the semi-open c-line. Against that, after knight takes d4, Nezhmetdinov manages to place his knight in a very strong central square at the opening. He has a space advantage. He can also apply a much more comfortable and fast piece deployment than his opponent. Of course, there will be constant pressure throughout the game on the d-line. After the knight takes d4, along with knight f6, knight c3 and e6, Tal's preference is the Nezhmetdinov variant. It's a very modest but very important continuation to control the center squares in the fifth horizontal. Guys, this continuation gives you considerable flexibility, so you can advance e5 in the future, or you can carry out your dream of advancing d5 under favorable conditions. Remember this advantage if you're playing Sicilian defense. You have a majority of pawns in the center. So, by making d5 in the future, if you manage to exchange the e4 pawn, that gives your opponent the upper hand. You will still have a pawn in the center, and so have a nice space advantage. Yes, the Nezhmetdinov variant is a pretty solid continuation. However, the thing is that it does not bother the opponent much yet. After the e6 move, because the e6 advance here prevents this bishop from looking at the g4 square, it is usually continued here with the g4 pawn advance to launch an attack from the king side, Kier's attack. The idea is pretty clear. I mean, it's an obvious variant. He can immediately disturb the knight and quickly launch an attack from the king side. But against e6, Nezhmetdinov's preference was the calmer bishop e2 move. He simply wants to continue his development. After bishop e2, Tal chose to develop his knight from the d7 square. In these continuations, we often see the knight developed from the d7 square, rather than the more natural c6. There are important reasons and benefits to this. To begin with, when the queenside bishop develops from square b7 in the future, a knight will not have blocked this bishop. Of course, the c vertical has been left open as well. However, the knight in d7 controls the center e5 square, which is of great importance. And as we will see later in the game, it can create a nice pressure from the c5 square to its opponent's center. Against the latest knight b d7, let's put it simply here. Yes, you have a weakness in square d6, and knight b5 would be a hasty approach at this point. It's a move far from damaging, because when your opponent counters with knight c5, he attacks against the central e4 pawn, and can quickly move your knight out of there. For this reason, Nezhmetdinov does not rush in this way, and completes the development of the king side with kingside castling. Mikhail Tal's choice here is a6. As a result, a variant of the Najdorf-Scheveningen combination was formed. Of course, in the Sicilian defense, the a6 move is a choice we face in almost all continuations. Well, maybe knight b5 didn't seem too dangerous, but you can't live with that anxiety for the rest of your life. It supports pawn advances that can cause significant problems, such as increasing pressure on the d6 pawn, gaining space from the queenside and pursuing the opposing knight, and pressing the center. He can also use his queen's bishop to apply pressure from square b7 to the center. It has many functions, and hail to Mikhail Najdorf from here. Against the latest a6, Nezhmetdinov continued with f4, increasing the space's superiority from the center and kingside. Guys, these side-by-side mobile pawns can pose great dangers when they are really harmonious. Nezhmetdinov will continue the game, possibly advancing f5 or e5 in the future. Now, Mikhail Tal continues his development with queen c7. Queen c7 is a very standard move in Sicilian defense. First of all, it increases the protection of the d6 pawn here, as well as provides pressure in the semi-open c vertical, which is one of the most important advantages, and it also provides control of the crucial e5 square, because we don't usually want this piece in the f6 square to be disturbed by e5 advancements. Queen c7, and with g4, Nezhmetdinov actually told Tal, "I want to mate you." Yes, that could be the meaning of pawn advance. Now, in this position, we are dealing with both grandmasters, although Nezhmetdinov did not get the title of grandmaster. But for me, he is a grandmaster. Let's try to understand the plans of both players here. We're used to attacking with pawn advances like this, but only after castling on the opposite wing. But beware, Nezhmetdinov is advancing pawns even though he's castled on the king side. First of all, this provides you with some advantages. If Nezhmetdinov had chosen to castle on the queen side rather than the king side, he could have launched a quick and effective attack from the queen side, just as Nezhmetdinov did. Of course, it's fair to say that Nezhmetdinov comes from the king side and the center, much faster and more efficiently. He's already launched his attack. It's not possible for Tal to react the same way at this point. Guys, if you plan to castle on the queen side, you need to quickly make a decision about the queen's bishop and queen so that you can castle on that side. But in this strategy, you don't have to rush about the bishop and queen yet. In other words, flexible approaches can occur. That's the beauty of it. But there are drawbacks, of course. What are those? Because you advanced the pawns in front of your king side, you have also weakened your king. Don't forget that. However, because Mikhail Tal did not touch any pawns on the king side, that wing is much safer and more robust. Of course, the e5 pawn is also a delicate pawn because it can no longer be supported by any pawn. And if this pawn falls, that is, if your opponent rips your center apart, your king will also get its share. You can stay on the defensive side, let alone attack. That's the thing, so both players need to be very careful. After g4, Tal played b5. If Nezhmetdinov demanded the knight here with g5, Tal would counterattack with b4, because there were no nice squares for the king to go to. That's why Nezhmetdinov played a3 to prevent it, and now he's renewing the g5 threat. Bishop b7, give your e4 pawn. Nezhmetdinov defended with bishop f3, and when the knight c5 once again demanded the pawn, queen e2. As we just said, the queen hasn't played since the opening, and he's made up his mind now. It helps in the defense of the f4 pawn, but it is not solely defensive. Both the g5 and this queen e5 support the demands for the knight. That's why Tal advanced e5 to prevent it. It would not be right to criticize this move, because you don't want to allow your opponent to advance e5. However, here's the thing. Tal has made a lot of pawn moves since the opening and has fallen significantly behind his opponent in development. The king is still in the center. Nezhmetdinov may soon complete his development, so it can be very dangerous for Tal to play from the center while the king is in the center and the center to open. Now, against e5, Nezhmetdinov has placed his knight in the weakened f5 square, and if this knight cannot be removed from the f5 square, the development of the king's bishop will not be possible. Tal sees this and has to push the knight away with another pawn move. But instead of immediately withdrawing his knight, Nezhmetdinov continued with f takes e5. And why is that? Because, as previously stated, he is far ahead in development than his opponent, and Tal's king is in the center. Nezhmetdinov is well aware of this. I need to open the center, the verticals, and the diagonals. That would be advantageous to me, he says. That's why he played f takes e5. He's trying to take the knight, and Tal shouldn't string along with his opponent, so he needs to keep the position closed as much as possible. He played d takes e5. However, the knight has now settled on square h6 as a result of the recent f takes e5 capture, because the bishop has taken control of this square. What do we always say? Knights are short-ranged pieces. They must be close to the opposing area. But here, Nezhmetdinov seems to have exaggerated a little. We understand that this knight prevents his opponent from castling to kingside, and if you exchange this knight with the bishop takes h6, it would be even worse. You can't castle again, and Nezhmetdinov still has a pair of bishops. This bishop in particular is an unrivaled bishop, and these squares would be extremely weak throughout the game. That's why Tal has to be patient against knight h6. Tal continued to play with knight e6. That's a pretty strong move. Now he may want to move the knight to d4. Beware, that will demand the queen and bishop. Yes, the bishop may be restricted by our pawns, but it has an important task. It defends the central e4 pawn and holds the center. This is very important. For this reason, with bishop g2, Nezhmetdinov made a precautionary move so that the knight d4 doesn't come with tempo. Also, beware, he made a discovered attack to the knight. And here, Tal protected his knight with bishop g7. I think it's very important here. A lot of strong players here could be attracted to the g5. Because, at first glance, the g5 appears to be a very strong move, doesn't it? We demand the knight. If the knight plays, the f7 pawn may be undefended, and the king's side may be shattered. But my guess is that, if Tal were to get this pawn advance from his opponent, he'd play bishop takes h6. So how does it differ from the previous one? This capture can no longer be done with the bishop. It has to be done with a pawn. Now that he's escaped this knight, Tal may have time for kingside castling. Yes, I admit, the kingside will not be very safe again because of this pawn. But being able to castle means that Tal has made significant progress in his position. We can already understand how important this is in the game. For these reasons, Nezhmetdinov is not attracted to advancing g5 here, and he's aware of this. My opponent just supported his knight and can castle to queenside. It may become difficult for me to reach the opposing king now. Nezhmetdinov sees that, and to catch the opposing king in the center, he plays rook takes f6 exchange sacrifice. So this sacrifice is not in vain. It serves an important purpose. After the bishop takes f6, the knight settled in the d5 square. That was the idea. He exchanged the knight that protects the d5 square, and there is a very strong knight. Well, you might ask what's going to happen. Can't this bishop take this knight? If so, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, give the knight. When knight escapes, d6 would demand the queen and rook. That's not good. That's why Tal played queen d8 against knight d5. Of course, he was supposed to protect the bishop. Here, when Nezhmetdinov once again demands the bishop with queen f2, Tal tries to defend by keeping the f vertical closed with the knight f4. Now, bishop takes f4, e takes f4. Tal's expectation here was probably the queen takes f4. However, due to the situation we have just said, Nezhmetdinov now pushes the material into the background in order to reach the rival king. He's making a powerful pawn sacrifice with the e5, which opens up the cross and vertical. He demands the bishop. E-line can be opened. That's why Tal played bishop takes e5, rook e1. Yes, e vertical is open again, but Tal thinks he can close this line with the f6. Do you agree? With knight takes f6, Nezhmetdinov now makes a knight sacrifice after first making an exchange sacrifice, and then a pawn sacrifice. So the bishop in a pin. You have to take it with the queen. There's queen d4 against that. Hats off to this move. I'm finishing the video here. We're not commenting on this move. Well, that was a bad joke. Now, after bishop takes d4, the bishop is pinned, and you have no chance of protecting it. Tal said, "Let me at least get my king off the dangerous e-line." Of course, we're the ones attacking here, so we don't want to exchange the queens. That's why he takes the bishop with the rook. And Tal played queen d8. He can exchange the queens. That would be perfect because he's ahead in material. But Nezhmetdinov continues to make sacrifices. Rook f5. Perfect. He's leaving the rook undefended, yes. But when the rook was taken, he took Tal's rook in corner and finally managed to reach Tal's king after sacrifices. King e7 is the only option. Queen g6, king e6, and after g takes f5, Tal left the game. Because there's only one move, king d6. Against that, the queen would fall with knight f7. It's a great game by Nezhmetdinov. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel. And click on the bell icon to stay updated with my new videos. Hope to see you in the next video. Take care.